Guruve Gaura Chanjaya Radhikaya Chadale Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tadbhaktaya Namo Namaha Vanchakalpatrubhischa Kripa Sindhuveva Cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Shri Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Dandavat Pranam devotees. This is a pretty unique sort of reply. You know that I've taken opportunity to normally reply to inbox questions or questions that have been personally asked or some particular Vaishnav's topics of some Siddhanta or some Tattva or some Leela, whatever it might be. And I've taken advantage of this forum to answer those questions. Here today, it's a little bit different in that I'm just responding to a class that I had heard, because from time to time, I will go to different classes given by devotees, because there's always so much to learn and to become inspired by and to have new insights into. So I have a habit of going to visit different forums and classes and Zoom conferences, and so not only participating in them as a facilitator, but also participating as a participant in many of these conferences or classes, I gain a lot of inspiration. So I was on a particular Zoom class the other day, and my wife was listening in the background, and the class was extremely nice and well prepared, and I think that the class had a very good flow, and there was good participation on the part of the listening audience, because the person who was facilitating the class was involving everyone. But at a certain point, a question came up which was not directly intrinsic, let's say, to the verse at hand and the topic at hand, but had some peripheral connection. And regardless, if somebody's asking a question, still it's their opportunity, if it's a question they genuinely have and they want to get answered. But the connotations that both myself and my wife heard in the question and in the answer were concerning. I don't want to make it seem more extreme than it really is. It was just concerning. I've often spoke about how easy it is, in the absence of the insulation that we had during ashram life, and especially during the time of our Srila Prabhupada, how much the philosophy warded off the potential infiltration and even the potential sort of, I'm trying to find a word to express it. Infiltration may be the best word. The infiltration of ideas, concepts, which don't really resonate with the ideals or the siddhanta of bhakti. And some things are more directly related to bhakti. Some things really are coming from the outside influences and the social engineering that's part of the outside influence. And those things seep into the porous nature of our community now, because many people are not living in a tight-knit ashram community, etc., etc. But you have many people living their individual lives, and they pick up many things, outside of a direct sort of inner circle Krishna consciousness, and sometimes those things filter back into the inner Vaishnav Mandal. So let me just get to the point here. A question was raised, and I'm going to kind of semi-quote paraphrase the question. I know that sounds funny to quote paraphrase, but I'm just not, it's not word for word, but it is pretty close, right? So the question was raised that in American culture, based on some sociological, historical, which indicates some academic study that somebody came up with, which really, you know, in every academic sort of study, there's some kind of counter study or some other academician who comes up with some other kind of insight. So none of these things are really absolute. Here is where it got a little dangerous. That the what I'm going to say entered into the mode of conversation in the Bhagavatam class unchecked for its veracity, right? It was just assumed that because two words were mentioned, sociologists and historians, right, whom we don't know who they are, what their background is, what their insight is, or anything else, but sociologists and historians say, right? Which even sometimes in our devotional circles, we have Prabhupada said, right? So, of course, especially when it comes to sources outside of our Vaishnav mentorial line or Vaishnav circle, we certainly take everything with a grain of salt because no one can attest to the quality, etc., of the person giving the information, right? So historians and sociologists have said, and this was the statement, American culture essentially has a pride in being ignorant and a tendency to go against the idea of learning. So, of course, the statement on its face value, there's no metric except, like I said, some academicians who may have put forth some idea about it, but there's been no concrete, absolute, evidence that doesn't have any counter that's been presented. No, this is the absolute fact, So that was the first thing, that idea was allowed to seep in unchecked. And even in one sense, even if the idea was allowed to seep in, right, then it could have quickly been corrected, so to speak. And I don't mean whether or not that person's sources are correct or this or that. What I mean is the perspective of Krishna consciousness in relation to that could have shown its insignificance in the face of bhakti, right? So, but the answer really also had some interesting things. So the answer to that question, and here's the question again, that American culture, based on some historians and sociologists, has a pride in being ignorant and against learning, and therefore do devotees have a harder time in preaching to people in American culture because of that. So the answer was, for those devotees who are serving Srila Prabhupada's mission in the Confederate States, they face more of an uphill grind actually in preaching, because I guess apparently the idea was here that the Confederate States, and I'm not sure if we're talking about everything below the Mason-Dixie line or how we're codifying Confederate States here, but whatever it means, that those who are preaching or serving in those places, they have more of an uphill grind because the indication was, or the connotation was, those people in those places do have a tendency to be less involved in learning and therefore, I guess, less capable of being able to digest and accept Krishna consciousness. Another reason that was given is because in those places, the tendency for sort of a myopic view of their own religious practice is stronger. In other words, if they're involved, and this was the actual statement that was given, that who are involved more in fundamentalist Christianity, that they are less capable of being open to other ideas and so forth and so on. So later on in the course of the answer, in a more expanded way, because then I made a comment, and I based the comment on observations that took place during my previous career and observation about where certain kinds of people connotated by this answer, where, you know, some of the more extreme views of that are found. The response to that was, well, even in those cases, it is probably more seen in rural areas, where again, the connotation was people in those areas are less apt to be attracted to learning and education and so forth. Unlike, and then there's a quote here, of those who are urban elites. So I don't know if the statement about urban elites was inclusive of the speaker, or was it just a reference to urbanites who, I don't know for what reason they're elite, but urban elites who do have more of an attraction to education and diversity of thought, etc., etc. So perhaps it was just not couched in the best language or whatever it might be, but there were several, and my wife, you know, my first inclination was, no, I'm not going to kind of respond to that, because I very seldom respond to just classes that I hear. But when she heard it also, she said, no, I think you should give some response. And again, in the response, in all humility, though I have some familiarization with that devotee from even many, many years ago, I don't have a recent close history of association, so I'm not sure of all of the personal dynamics of the devotee giving the class. And as I said right in the beginning, the substance of the class in context of what the class was about in Srimad Bhagavatam, I thought was very well done, very well laid out, very well prepared, and had great participation, everything. So I'm only addressing this section and addressing the possibility of the danger of allowing certain socio-political, socially engineered concepts to enter into the Vaishnava Mandal, unchecked, because somehow or another we feel a certain comfort zone with our own socio-political views, and therefore we feel it okay that where we're discussing an absolute thing, which is Srimad Bhagavatam, the relative conceptions we have can be put in equal footing or even in the same arena with those absolute truths. And the danger here being they may be accepted by your audience or by the listeners as being related to, yeah, this is all part of the class and the person's an authority on the subject of Srimad Bhagavatam, and what they have said here is also equally true and absolute. When just the opposite is the fact that it's really subjective. It could in fact be conjecture in many cases, or assumptive in many cases, and it's not an absolute fact, right? So I'm being more specific now. The idea that people living in a particular geography are less apt to be able to take to bhakti is really not a spiritually proven fact. There is no reference anywhere in Shastra to something like that. If you do find anything even closely related to it, it would be based on the nature of sukriti or lack thereof. Sukriti meaning pious activities, or lack thereof, to be able to resonate with the teachings of bhakti. So there is no geographic, racial, cultural, or any other sort of material obfuscation to receiving the teachings of bhakti, right? And if you're making generalizations that according to your geographic location, you're more apt to be influenced by the cultural patterns in that area, that's a different discussion. But bhakti, because the answer to the question, the question was essentially, do devotees have a harder time preaching to people because of that? And the answer would be, you can go anywhere in the world, what to speak of America, and find extreme sectarianism or fundamentalism in various religions, from Christianity to Islam to Buddhism to whatever it might be, which is predominant in that particular locale, right? But still it will come down to a matter of the individual sukriti and nature of whomever you're preaching to. So bhakti cannot be checked by these things. And therefore, the idea of answering the question based on affirming that, yes, that, people in this area and people with this sort of mentality, it is more unlikely that they will take to Krishna consciousness. And therefore, and this is something that I'm resonating back to, and my wife brought up, there was actually a time when there was a idea that doing book distribution, and especially doing it in urban minority areas, would not be as fruitful as doing it in certain other places, right? Of course, I think there were corrective measures that went on in the course of time, and there was more consideration about the actual nature of why we're distributing books than the material results, meaning collection of money, being the more predominant consideration. So I think at a certain time they realized, yes, everyone should have the opportunity to have access to Srila Prabhupada's books, etc., etc. I don't ever think there was some kind of hideous plan to deny anybody, but I just think the general thinking, which was partly, influenced by someone's cultural bias or their upbringing or whatever the case is, might have led to that. Well, especially in the contemporary climate that we're in now, the socio-political climate that we're in now, you have a lot of influences that have come to people via their connections with whatever their subjective socio-political leanings are. But those things have no bearing in bhakti. So, in fact, the base of bhakti, the essential foundational premise of bhakti, is that we're not the body. And therefore, the idea of how bhakti is spread, or the efficacy of where you can spread bhakti, or the who's eligible to receive it, right, so forth, so on, we have to try to answer more in the line of what bhakti's power is versus what is the sociological, sort of socio, political or socio-economic considerations and all these things. We have to look, two things: the potency of the person preaching. For instance, how Srila Prabhupada began his preaching on the Bowery, not on the Upper West Side, not at a university. He began his preaching on the Bowery and in Tompkins Square Park, which was full of the diversity of people. I'm born up in Brooklyn and hung out in those places, right? So the history of those places was that it was not some kind of academic elite who hung out there. There was a huge swath of all kinds of socio-economic status and educational status, everything, right? And various people became attracted to Srila Prabhupada. So potency of the preacher is probably paramount. The area also where there may be some leanings towards, even fundamental religion of any sort, Christianity, Islam, whatever it might be, a lot will also depend on the ability of the preacher to make a presentation that resonates with the value systems and with the sort of cultural norms of that place. And if you have an inherent, sort of bias against what that is, it may be in fact more difficult to preach there. In opening temples in Africa, which I did for 8 or 9 years, right, we certainly encountered situations where there was a very heavy influence of missionary activity and therefore a great pushback in the name of Christianity and Christianity being the only way. But by the nature of how the preaching went on, many people, even who initially may have had pushback, began to resonate with the mood and attitude and presentation of the devotees. And for those who could not completely resonate with the teachings, many were able to resonate with the fact that it was also a bona fide way of serving God, just not one I can practice, right? So, and then there may have been those who still were very hardcore resistant to the idea of anything except their own religious view. But that's not something that's strictly geographical. So anyway, my real point here probably is being very careful about the subtlety of subjective socio-political dynamics or our own particular socio-political leanings and all, allowing that to come into the arena where something absolute like Sriman Bhagavatam is being discussed, and that entering as statements which may be equated with statements that are absolute facts mentioned in Srimad Bhagavatam. So, to the point, historians and sociologists, whom we don't know who they are and even what grouping that was from, their particular insight on whether or not people have a prideful ignorance doesn't really mean very much. In the circle of where absolute things are being discussed, their perspective doesn't really hold much water, right? Because we don't know who they are, for one, and what their qualification is besides academic recognition to speak beyond their subjective opinions, right? And whatever minute examples they may have taken, because you certainly haven't had a case where somebody's gone out and sort of done a metric on the entire population or something, right? So that's one thing. Two, in the answer to the question, certainly there has to be the predominance of how the absolute position of bhakti has a potency and power beyond considerations of subjective or material, socio-political, socio-economic considerations. Because if we allow that to enter, it becomes part of the fabric that we can consider that, certain people, they're not really so eligible for bhakti. And other people are more eligible for bhakti. And that eligibility not being based on sukriti, which is the statement of Sastra, but being based on socio-political leanings, etc., etc. So anyway, I don't want to belabor the point. My wife said, yes, you should certainly, because when we heard it, we both, our ears kind of, perked up. And again, I don't want to take away from the wonderful nature of the class as a whole. Just something that, because it's in my consciousness, because I heard it, right? It's my responsibility to then bring it out. So that was all. That was simply a point that I thought needed to be discussed, and I feel better probably in getting it out and expressing it. So this may not have so much bearing to many devotees, but for those maybe who participated who may hear this, then maybe some consideration can be taken how we can be more scrutinizing about differentiating maybe our personal or subjective ideals, especially if we're the presenter of a Srimad Bhagavatam class, as opposed to finding an actual sastric base for it. Yeah. All right. Dandavat pranam. Ogwez Srila Gurudev, Srila Prabhupada, Guru Varga. Jai Radhe Radhe.